Ladies and gentlemen, today I will present all what you need to know about asphyxia, in particularly what you need to know about hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy of the newborn, because if you don't know the pathophysiology, the clinics, and also the possible therapeutic means, you cannot really treat babies with hypothermia. I think it's a prerequisite that you know the pathophysiology, clinic, and interventions you can do to be successful. I have made it easy for you because some of you were on night duty, like Dr. Despina. She might fall asleep, but when she wakes up, she can always ensure herself where we are. The red quadrangles are indicating that I'm speaking about pathophysiology. The blue ones are indicating that I speak about the clinical correlates of that pathophysiology, and green that I discuss therapeutic interventions. So I will now, as a first thing, first slide. The most important thing for you is to know that there are two phases. One is a non-transcriptional phase, which is a phase which is actually characterized by biochemical, biomolecular events in the cell. And then in a moment I will tell you about the transcriptional phase, where the gene, the nucleus of the cell, the genes are transcribed to produce new proteins. First, let's start with the transcriptional phase, which lasts about the first hour. It occurs very early, very rapidly, while the transcriptional phase starts with about 2 hours. So, when there is lack of oxygen, there is not enough ATP produced for the ion pump, and because of that, the ion pump does not keep up the electrophysiological gradient, the membrane potential. The membrane potential alters, and because of that, the ion gates are voltage dependent, and ion channels open up, and calcium streams into the cell, and now will elicit a whole cascade of signals. One of the first cascades is the fact that neurotransmitter glutamate is released in excess to the extracellular space, and finally attaches and binds to the receptor. It alters the receptor's configuration, and again more calcium is flowing into the cell. In addition, we have production then of nitric oxide radicals, but also oxygen radicals, particularly when the doctor comes on call and resuscitates the baby with 100% oxygen or oxygen. So you can see these are the biochemical events, and we have an energy failure which results in a failure of the ion pump, and then the extrusion and secretion and release of neurotransmitter, which overstimulates the brain, is then the phase of excitotoxicity. And we also have radical formation. In the second phase now, next, we have the transcriptional phase. The genes of the nucleus are transcribed in a particular way, proteins are synthesized, and various responses are occurring. First, an immune response. Hypoxic ischemic events are associated with inflammation. Interesting enough, lack of oxygen, the end result is a strong inflammation. We will also hear that CRP is, for example, increased. Now, there are cytokines produced, all the interleukins, and they also contribute to the damage of hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. Then there are proteins synthesized which induce apoptosis, for example, all the caspases, and there are also proteins synthesized which help to maintain the structure of the brain by inhibiting a repair. Imagine our great, wonderful Dr. Ariadne Malamidze-Buchner would wake up in the morning and her brain was rearranged. That would be terrible. That's why the brain has a mechanism, particularly in the myelin, which has proteins which are called no-go. Like in roulette, no more goes, all must stay the same. So they also, of course, inhibit repair. Then we have proteins which help to mount a proliferation of cells, to produce new stem cells, and also proteins like heat shock proteins which help to repair the cells. Next. There is a wonderful article by Donna Ferrero in Pharmacology and Therapeutics, which is a very comprehensive article, and it's worthwhile that you get it and read it. It is listing all the important things which you have to know about hypoxiglycemic encephalopathy, and you can see already various issues I have already mentioned. For example, you can inhibit excitotoxicity, you can use antioxidants, anti-inflammatory agents, cell death inhibitors, growth factors, and hypothermia. So, next. We have a series of drugs, and I have grouped them according to their function in time. You may use drugs which are only useful if you use them prophylactically. For example, calcium antagonists like flunarizine, it's logical that they can only be used prophylactically, because once calcium is in the cell, it's not much use to block it. So this has been shown in animal experiments that you can use antagonists against calcium, but I will come back to that. We have drugs which protect against injury progression, and these are drugs which are blocking the NMDA receptor, which reduce radical production, and of course you will hear today several times erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is also an anti-apoptotic factor and prevents apoptosis. We also can use stimulating drugs which increase the regeneration. These are neurotrophic factors, and as I said already, we could even prevent the inhibition of repair. Next. Now I will discuss with you the energy and electrical failure. When the brain does not see enough oxygen, it's like an electrical power failure in the city of Athens or anywhere. First of all, as we already learned, there is not enough ATP produced, the energy pump fails, the electrical potential is altered, the membrane is depolarized, and because of that, the ion channels open, calcium is flowing into the cell, and the whole signal cascade is activated. On the other hand, we have clinical things which we know are observable, like lactate production, and we also know that the neurotransmitter has to be taken up again to avoid excitotoxicity. Cytochrome C is extruded, and that induces apoptosis, and so we have a series of effects just by not having enough ATP, altering electric potential, and some biochemical events. Next. I would like you to know also that there are two concepts of brain injury. One concept which relates to the premature, and one which relates to the mature newborn. And the premature concept is that there is not enough oxygen brought to the white matter, so that's why you have periventricular leukomalacia. If it's very grave, you will even have cystic and focal leukomalacia with real holes in the white matter. This is the so-called hypoperfusion oligodendra concept promoted by Volpi, because these are the oligodendroglial cells which are mainly affected in the white matter, and that's why we have this kind of injury. And then in the mature, we have a different picture, because the mature baby has already receptors for various neurotransmitters, which are located in the basal ganglia and in the cortex. Consequently, the hypoxic ischemic injury in the mature has more the picture of an excitotoxicity effect, because it hits those areas of the brain where the receptors are already there. As I said, the basal ganglia and the cortex. Next.
You know why it doesn't function, because you haven't taken this out.
Please, I'm recording it for the... Oh, God. Because this is for the internet, so you will be on internet. Now, look. This is important for you to know, that the hypoxic ischemic injury occurs in various phases. There's a first phase where the energy levels fall to a very low level. You can see here the nucleotides, they fall in the spectroscopy, it has been shown. It falls, and then the doctor comes, and then the energy levels are brought back to a normal level, and we have a short period where the energetic level is the same as it was before, and then we go into a secondary phase. And this is the therapeutic window where one could prevent the secondary phase and maybe mitigate and ameliorate the injury to a lower risk. You would say to me, how can I as doctor know at bedside in which phase I am in? And I tell you, yes, like Obama, yes you can. Because if you use an EEG, either the conventional EEG or the AEG, you can clearly see the reflection. It is completely reflected what occurs, what you measure in spectroscopy. So this is one way to know which phase you're in, and also indicating the severity of the injury, because you can see this goes in parallel with the energy levels in the brain. Next. Next, I want to tell you that we have, of course, various clinical means to see how much injury is going on by measuring the lactate, the pH, the base deficit, also by looking at the neurological signs. For example, the baby is not breathing, is hypotonic. And this is now one very important thing for you. We must all learn to use the Thompson score. The Thompson score is a neurological score which is very simple and is very helpful, and to some extent is a good surrogate for an EEG. We will come back to that. We know that APGARs are low. Thompson score more than 9 is definitely a sign of severe injury, and even rectal temperature will fall if the brain is injured because it does not produce enough metabolic heat. Next. The gold standard for assessing the brain injury objectively is the use of the AEG, the amplitude integrated EEG, which is just a simple way of just displaying the amplitudes and the background voltage, how high it is. And you can see here an analysis of 3 investigators. They all show a very high sensitivity of AEG and also a very high specificity. This is the most useful, practical and objective way to assess the severity of hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. Next. Now we go to therapies. We have already said that calcium is the first event which triggers a whole cascade of pathology. So, calcium channel blockers have been used also in newborns, but they were very unsuccessful. Levine used it in 4 newborns. All 4 developed severe hypotension, and with it even made the hypoperfusion worse. So I think this is not a way to go. Calcium channels blockers are not useful. They are too late, and they could be only used prophylactic, which is not possible. And next slide. I will now discuss the failure to detoxify the brain and how we can get rid of the neurotransmitters which are in excess and which are toxic. So we are now discussing how we can avoid or mitigate excitotoxicity. Next. You can see here that glutamate binds to its receptors, which then will alter its configuration and let calcium in and potassium out. It is not only altering the receptor, but it also starts by indirect gating, phosphorylating, activating enzymes which produce new proteins, for example, nitric oxide synthesis. Next. Glutamate toxicity is a fact in newborn, which has been confirmed by Hagberg, measuring glutamate in the cerebrospinal fluid, and you can see it's distinctly elevated, particularly when you have severe encephalopathy, but also moderate and mild. The left panel here is very important because it shows an experiment in rats which have been subjected to 20 minutes severe ischemic hypoxic conditions, and you can see there is an enormous surge in glutamate. This is glutamate increasing to very high levels if the animal is at normal body temperature. However, if the animal is cooled to a lower temperature, 33 or 28, there is no surge of glutamate, there is no excitotoxicity. So this is a very clear proof also that hypothermia reduces the excitotoxicity in newborns and animals. Next slide. Here you can see the effect of glutamate toxicity in form of seizures. Seizures are always an expression of glutamate excitotoxicity. So you clinically know when there is an enormous release of glutamate in the brain. Usually they occur later, but the earlier the seizures occur, the more severely injured is the brain. And seizures are always a sign of central nervous system injury, even if the background voltage of the brain is normal. You can see that here. This is a normal voltage background, but there are seizures. This is no longer a normal background, but not that bad, and you can see all the seizures in the EEG, and this of course is already a very suppressed EEG, showing a lot of burst suppression pattern. Next. Neonatal seizures are associated by themselves with a worse neurological outcome, and they affect the injury independent of the severity of hypoxic ischemic brain injury. This was shown by Glass from San Francisco, published in Journal of Pediatrics, and you can see the basal nuclei pattern in severe asphyxiated babies was injured very often, while it was not in those who had no seizures, and in between mild and moderate. So that clearly shows that the seizures per se, all those babies had seizure, had hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. Some had no seizures, some had mild, some had severe, and you can see the injury is much stronger if in addition to the hypoxic ischemic injury they also had seizures, as indicated by the alterations in the NMR. Next slide. It is very important to know about asphyxia not only from the clinical or the electroencephalographic viewpoint. You also do not walk with one leg, you walk with two legs, and in the same way you would always assess the severity with two means. Once electroencephalographic and once clinically with the Thompson score. This here is an example shown. A baby is born. The AHE shows very low background voltage in the first 6 hours. The AHE recovers. You can see there's a higher voltage background at 48, but unfortunately in the secondary phase of asphyxia it deteriorates again very strongly to very low levels. And the same is reflected in assessing the Thompson score, which is very high in the first 6 hours, is then lower, that means improvement in neurology, and gets worse again at 72 hours. So I believe it's important for you to know when you treat babies that these must go in parallel. If they do not go in parallel, something is wrong, either with your assessment or with your technical recording of the AHE. Next slide. Now we come again to therapy. How can we treat excitotoxicity? First, we know that glutamate docks on the N-methyl-D-aspartate receptor, which opens then the channel, and you can see also magnesium here in the channel. And of course, we have an array of drugs which would decrease excitotoxicity. The first one, which sort of mechanically seems to block the influx of calcium, is the magnesium. So when we use magnesium, it's an NMDA antagonist. The success has not been very strong. We have other drugs, you know, and we use in newborns like ketamine. Dextromethorphan is a mixture which is an anti-epileptic drug, which is also in cough mixture, and xenon recently has been added to the list of drugs which would decrease excitotoxicity. You can also see in the non-NMDA channels, the so-called kainate and GABA channels, you find benzodiazepines and also barbiturates, which always have again and again been proposed to mitigate the brain injury. Next slide. However, barbiturates were not shown to be really important drugs. They have not even shown to be statistically significantly effective, and also the number of babies studied is extremely low. Look at these numbers here, 11, 14, 12 in single studies. So in short, barbiturates are not the choice of drug in asphyxiated babies. So please do not immediately apply phenobarb, because it will also make it impossible to assess the severity. The AHE will be altered, and phenobarb in itself is an apoptosis-inducing drug. Next. Magnesium sulfate has been used. Many large randomized controlled studies have been done and published, but in all of them you can see that the primary outcome never was significantly altered by applying magnesium. You can see in all these studies what magnesium does. It does improve the secondary outcome. You have more moderate cerebral palsy with magnesium, and also some improvement in secondary outcomes. But it does not even alter the AHE in terms of improving immediate evidence that it would do something. So magnesium, despite many, many attempts, still has not been proven to be a real drug of choice. Next. Dextromethorphan has not been applied to newborns, but we applied dextromethorphan to newborn mice, and you can see when you give dextromethorphan to newborn mice, the lesion diameter is reduced, significantly reduced in the white matter, whether the brain has been sensitized before with various things like interleukins and others. Definitely a strong effect on the lesion size with dextromethorphan in the white matter. Next. Xenon has recently been induced and applied to animals, newborn piglets. Xenon obviously is also an NMDA antagonist and prevents the progression of the excitotoxic cascade. And it obviously has additional effects other than NMDA antagonistic action. Possibly inhibit AMPA and kinase receptors as well. So this will be another phase which will be studied, and we'll learn about it soon. Next. All those who were students and liked to try cannabinoids, hashish, might now be very glad to see hashish as a drug against brain injury. And cannabinoids have been shown that they do have a neuroprotective effect. They obviously modify the intracellular signaling and also have an effect on neurons and glia. However, there's only one studies out, and I don't advise you now to go ahead and buy large doses of hashish for your unit. Next slide. Glutamate toxicity is a very important thing because, as you can see, it results finally also in the production of nitric oxide, and nitric oxide is a signal which spreads from cell to cell. You remember that it even goes into the cells of the pulmonary vasculature, and so this nitric oxide, which is synthesized, is a multiplicator of the injury. And for that reason, next slide, we want to do something about it. You can see glutamate causes more calcium influx, also causes phosphorylation of an enzyme nitric oxide synthase, which produces nitric oxide, which in turn converts into radicals, which anyway cause necrosis, but also cause activation of caspase by extrusion of cytochrome C and apoptosis. So it's very logical, it would be important to block the synthesis of nitric oxide. Next slide. And here you can see the study of Peter Scholter in Utrecht, and one effect is very clear. First of all, the nucleotides ATP are not decreasing as much when 2-iminobutyrin, a drug, is given in compared to control. But the most striking effect of this 2-iminobutyrin is the inhibition of the nitric oxide synthase, because when this is not produced, apoptosis does not occur, caspases are not activated. And you can see there's factually no activation of the caspase 3, which induces apoptosis with iminobutyrin compared to vehicle treatment. Next. And next chapter in asphyxia is how do we detoxify the cell from the radicals? How can we get rid of radical toxicity? Next. Radicals are produced by the mitochondria in the phagocytes from heme proteins, from prostaglandins, and from xanthins. And you already know that prostaglandins can be inhibited by indomethacin, and xanthins can be inhibited to convert to hypoxanthine by allopurinol. The problem of radicals is that they are dangerous per se. They can, with the help of iron, or in the presence of iron, be converted to an even more dangerous radical, the hydroxyl radical. And you already make this association. Many babies also have bleedings in the brain which provide a lot of iron. Of course, you can get rid of the radicals with enzymes. Next slide. First, you can reduce radical production by blocking the synthesis of prostaglandins from arachidonic acid, and indomethacin is a drug we all use. Indomethacin is a drug which has also shown to have an independent effect on the brain in terms of better outcome when it's given. You can also block the conversion of hypoxanthine to xanthine and uric acid by allopurinol, and allopurinol has also been tried as a drug in hypoxic-ischemic encephalopathy. Next. This is just to show that indomethacin does reduce the radical production. Next slide. And this is a slide which shows in animal experiments that when allopurinol is given, then the right and left hemisphere have about the same size, and that means there is no injury to the right and to the left, one of which has been injured. The interesting thing about allopurinol is that it has been shown to be very effective in animal experiments, but when it was applied to newborns, the group in Utrecht has done that, Frank van Bell, it has never reached a real significant change in the outcome. Next. Here we have a whole array of scavengers, that means drugs which take away the radicals from the cells, like vitamin E or ascorbic acid, and of course iron chelators, because if you take the iron out, the hydroxyl radical cannot so easily be produced. And of course glutathione peroxidase, catalase, and recently melatonin and an artificial tetracycline which is called minocycline. These are all radical scavengers and can be applied extra. Next slide. Now we have already heard that hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy is associated with a strong inflammation, a strong inflammatory response. Consequently, it's natural to apply anti-inflammatory drugs like indomethacin, the cyclooxygenase inhibitor, or tetracycline, the minocycline. And of course, analgesic drugs, we have already learned from other studies, are anti-inflammatory. Morphium and naloxone have anti-inflammatory property. Next. Here is already a first study by Ali who used ascorbic acid, vitamin C, and ibuprofen in asphyxiated newborns with hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. They could not show a very strong, definitely no significant effect, but there is some improvement in neurological abnormalities and also some less developmental retardation, but the effect is very weak. Maybe was not given long enough, maybe the dosage was not strong enough. This needs further investigations. Next. Morphine, even at sub-picomolar concentrations, exerts a potent anti-inflammatory and neuroprotective effect. Through the inhibition of microglia in the brain is this group of cells which mount the inflammatory response. They are the cells which are responsible for that. Naloxone also may have a neuroprotective effect, but there are not sufficient data available to prove that. Next slide. Now we come to the part when all the biochemical reactions are over, have passed, where we can try to improve the regeneration of the brain. We can apply drugs which would prevent the apoptosis in form of anti-apoptotic factors, and we can stimulate the proliferation of new cells stem cells, glia cells, neurons by neurotrophic factors. Next. First of all, we need to know that apoptosis is induced by tumor necrosis factor alpha, an inflammatory protein, Fas ligand, trail, and other substances. But hypoxia is also inducing apoptosis because it results in extrusion of cytochrome C, which with this compound activates caspase 9 and then 3, 6, and 7 and induces apoptosis. So apoptosis is a strong factor in the course of the disease, and that's why, next slide, we must also assess apoptosis in the brain. You will tell me now, dear Professor Simbrunner, it's impossible for me at bedside to assess the apoptosis of brain cells. And I say, it's not true. You can. All you need is a tape measure, which you put around the circumference and you measure every day or every second day to determine the brain growth. Because the head circumference you measure is very, very closely correlated to the brain growth. If the brain does not grow, then you have obviously a strong apoptosis or not sufficient regeneration from injury. This study here by Roth shows that the fall in nucleotides with the asphyxia process to very low levels is associated with very, very low head circumference, small head circumference later on at 4 years. You can see the head circumference is maybe several standard deviations from the norm. And this is in relationship to the injury, measured in form of nucleotides being low in the brain at the asphyxia occurrence. So please, one thing, measure apoptosis, measure brain growth in your NICU. Next. Moderate hypothermia is known to reduce the apoptosis in the newborn brain. On the left side you have the panel which shows the number of necrotic cells in percentage. You can see hypothermia does not reduce the number of necrotic cells. It's the same amount whether you have a normal temperature or a low temperature. However, hypothermia has a very strong effect on apoptosis. It reduces it to a so-called normal level of apoptosis because you remember the brain, the newborn brain, needs apoptosis to shape its structure. It's like a house which is built and then windows are broken out so that light can come in. Similarly, the brain is made and then with apoptosis the various structures are established. And this is important not to abolish apoptosis completely but to a normal level, and that's what hypothermia does. It reduces it to the normal level of apoptosis so the brain can develop normal. Next slide. A very important drug will be and is already erythropoietin as a neuroprotective or stimulating neuroproliferation. Erythropoietin has a neurotrophic activity. It reduces glutamate excitotoxicity. It even increases glutathione peroxidase activity. And in the course of neurotrophic factors we will also discuss a moment later insulin-like growth factors and derivatives. Next slide. Erythropoietin, as shown here, strongly reduces the infarct volume in animal experiments. You don't need statistics. You can see in histology the large lesion if erythropoietin is not given, and factually a nearly normal brain when erythropoietin is given. Next slide. In our study we also showed, the colleagues in China in collaboration with me showed that erythropoietin treatment in human newborns improved neurological outcome of newborns with hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. It's already available in pediatrics electronic pages. Next. The dosage of erythropoietin given to these babies was the same as we use, 300 units in one protocol and 500 units in another. It was applied in the first 48 hours, so in the first 2 days, and then was given every second day for 2 weeks. Both regimes have been investigated. Next slide shows the effect of erythropoietin administered as I just showed. You can see deaths or moderately severely disabled newborns are strongly fewer when erythropoietin is given. Erythropoietin reduces deaths or moderate to severe disability from 44 to 25% overall. It has a very strong effect in the moderate hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy group, reduces it from 32 to 6%. And even some effect, also not very significant, in the severe hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy group. I think this is a very important result and will be implied in treatment. Next. Even the developmental delay is reduced with erythropoietin overall, but strongly in the moderate, but also quite distinctly in the severe hypoxic ischemia group. Next. As a last chapter of neurotrophic drugs, I will discuss all derivatives of insulin-like growth factor 1, and insulin-like growth factor 1 was the first to be studied. You can see clybromate, that's a compound I will discuss in a moment, reduces the injury very much in animals. You can see a very significant effect on various parts of the brain as studied and published by Gluckman. Next slide. He first investigated insulin-like growth factor. The problem was that it is limited in its action to the first few hours after the injury, normothermic brain. Then an artificial compound was designed which has only 4 or 3 peptides, glycine, proline and glutamine, and this compound has the same effect as insulin-like growth factor, but it is easily applied, it passes the brain barrier, it has many advantages. And an even newer compound, which is even more promising because it has a longer half-life and is even available if you give it orally. So these derivatives of insulin-like growth factors like glypromate and NNZ, still a compound under investigation, will be also compounds which will be applied to improve the outcome of newborn babies. Next. This story I have already told at the very beginning when I said what would happen if Dr. Malamitzi-Buchner would wake up and the brain would be arranged in a new fashion. Next slide. It's very clear that there are proteins which inhibit the regeneration of neurons, studied in animals in South American axolotl where their cord was cut. And when the animal was very young, you can see that the nerve can be repaired by new nerve fibers growing through the injury zone. However, when the animal is older, it does not occur anymore. And you can see here, as the axons are myelinated, there is no possibility of repair anymore. So some people have now thought to do something against these proteins which impair the repair by producing antibodies against the so-called no-go proteins. Next slide. I am now summarizing what I have told you. First, the pathophysiology of asphyxia in the mature newborn. It starts with fetal distress. There is not enough oxygen delivered. Then we have an hypoxic insult, which opens the ion channels, and you have the release of glutamate and also production of nitric oxide, and you have radical formation. And these are actually potentiating themselves in the process. We know that there is, of course, the problem that now the basal ganglia and the cortex, which have these receptors, are affected by this excitotoxicity. Apoptosis is introduced. We use anti-apoptotic factors, we use neurotrophins, and enhanced proliferation. And we talked about preventing the antibodies to prevent the repair. On the right side, we discuss now the pathophysiology of prematures. Usually prematurity occurs because mothers have infection, and that's the cause of prematurity. At the same time, infection is associated with interleukins, which cause an ischemic hypoperfusion, and of course leads to the same processes as we have discussed before. We know that some babies will develop intraventricular hemorrhage, which produces and provides now iron to convert the radicals to the even more toxic hydroxyl radicals. And so the injury of oligodendral white matter occurs. I thank you very much for your attention, and I want you to go to the website of Ipokrates, www.ipokrates.info, where we have now a new section, Ipokrates TV Teleeducation, where you in the future will be able to listen to these lectures and view these lectures on internet. Thank you very much.